A Love Meant to Last. Ryan Torres and Anya Logan's story began on a summer evening at a small charity event in their city. Ryan, a former firefighter with a reputation for bravery, had volunteered to assist with the event's security. Anya, a passionate artist and advocate for children's rights, was showcasing her work to raise funds for a local youth center. From the moment they locked eyes, it was as though time slowed down. Their chemistry was immediate and undeniable. Ryan was captivated by Anya's kindness and determination. Despite the harrowing stories he often encountered in his line of work, her optimism and dedication to helping others reignited a light in him he hadn't realized was dimming. Anya, in turn, saw in Ryan a grounded strength and compassion that matched her own. They talked late into the night, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, and their shared desire to make a difference. Their love grew quickly and effortlessly. For them, every moment together was a discovery. They found joy in each other's hobbies and passions. Anya would spend hours in Ryan's workshop, watching him craft furniture out of old wood, and Ryan would often accompany Anya to art exhibits, offering his thoughtful critiques of her latest creations. Friends and family marveled at their connection, calling them soulmates who completed each other in ways rarely seen. In the fall of 2022, after 2 years of dating, Ryan proposed to Anya in a small, intimate ceremony by the lake where they often went for walks. He had crafted a wooden ring box himself, engraving a quote inside that read, "Forever and always, through every storm." When she said yes, they held each other, feeling that their futures had finally aligned. They married a few months later, in the backyard of Anya's childhood home. It was a small wedding, attended only by close friends and family. Anya wore a simple, flowing dress she had sewn herself, while Ryan stood proudly in a suit that he had inherited from his grandfather. Their vows were deeply personal, filled with promises to support each other's dreams, to be each other's safe haven, and to always make time for laughter. The couple moved into a modest, 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood. They filled it with love, laughter, and carefully chosen mementos from their lives together. Every wall displayed Anya's paintings and photographs of their travels, while Ryan's handcrafted furniture filled each room. They had plans to start a family, dreaming of children who would grow up in a world they were determined to make better. For months, their life was blissful. Every morning, Ryan would wake up early to prepare Anya's favorite coffee, sneaking it into the bedroom to surprise her. Anya, in turn, left small sketches of happy moments they shared around the house for Ryan to find. Images of a quiet evening by the fireplace or a spontaneous dance in the kitchen. They were planning a trip overseas, a dream honeymoon they had yet to take, and were saving every penny to make it unforgettable. However, as the seasons change, Ryan and Anya's idyllic life was about to take an unexpected turn. Ryan had recently joined a local community organization focused on rebuilding areas affected by natural disasters, and while he was grateful for the work, he had begun to notice things that unsettled him. A few of his colleagues seemed to be involved in something shady. Funds were occasionally missing, and supplies meant for families affected by storms seemed to vanish with no explanation. One day, Ryan brought his suspicions to his supervisor, a decision that didn't sit well with everyone on the team. A few of his coworkers began to distance themselves, while others made snide comments, accusing him of overstepping his bounds. Anya encouraged him to stick with his principles, even if it meant facing hostility. She knew the importance of Ryan's work, and despite the tension, she believed it would pass. Anya herself had taken on a new project that kept her busy at all hours. She was working on a mural for the children's wing of the hospital, a piece she had poured her heart into. Her days were filled with laughter and stories from the children, while her nights were spent at home, painting, lost in the colors and shapes that brought her so much joy. The couple had no idea that a storm was quietly brewing around them. One evening, Ryan returned home after a particularly tense day at work. He didn't share the details with Anya, not wanting to worry her, but she noticed the lines of stress on his face. They spent the evening unwinding, sharing stories from their day, and he surprised her with a homemade dinner of her favorite pasta. As they sat in the cozy warmth of their home, they felt a renewed sense of peace, as if nothing could ever shake the foundation they had built. But that night, as they settled into bed, an uneasy feeling lingered in the air, one that neither could quite put into words. Ryan held Anya close, reassuring her without saying a word. She fell asleep in his arms, feeling safe and loved, unaware that this would be one of the last nights they would share together. Their love story was one that friends and family believed would last forever. But as their peaceful life became entangled in the tension of Ryan's work and the growing sense of danger that shadowed them, neither could foresee the tragic fate that awaited them. The discovery and shock. The next morning, a quiet unease hung in the air. Ryan and Anya's home, usually alive with light and laughter, stood silent. Ryan's workplace grew concerned when he didn't show up and couldn't be reached. This was out of character. He was known for his reliability. When Anya's colleagues at the hospital noted her absence as well, concern spread quickly. Ryan's friend, Mark, a fellow volunteer at the disaster relief organization, decided to check on them. He drove to their home, expecting to find Ryan or Anya with an easy explanation. But as he approached the house, a sense of dread crept over him. The usually inviting front yard seemed eerily still, and the curtains were drawn tight. Mark knocked on the door, calling out for Ryan. When no one answered, he tested the door and found it unlocked. With his heart pounding, he stepped inside, hoping to find them simply asleep or preoccupied. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. The living room was in disarray, furniture overturned, shattered glass scattered across the floor, and a chilling silence that seemed to echo off the walls. Anya's art supplies lay strewn across the floor, a canvas torn in half. Mark's eyes traveled from the broken objects to the center of the room, where he saw Ryan and Anya's lifeless bodies. Overwhelmed, Mark stumbled backward, fumbling for his phone. He dialed 911, his voice shaking as he tried to describe the scene. Within minutes, the police arrived, sealing off the house and beginning their investigation. The officers surveyed the scene, their faces drawn with grim focus. They noted details that suggested a brutal struggle: the broken furniture, the scattered items, the faint smell of gasoline in the air. This was no simple home invasion. Whoever had committed this crime had done so with rage, leaving behind an imprint of malice that lingered even after they had fled. The bodies of Ryan and Anya lay close together, their hands almost touching. Despite the violent nature of the crime, there was something hauntingly tender in the way they were positioned, as though even in their last moments, they had reached for each other. A detective on the scene, hardened by years of experience, found himself looking away, unable to meet the sight of the young couple who had clearly meant so much to each other. As investigators moved through the house, they found other peculiar details that deepened the mystery. The drawers had been pulled out, and cabinets lay open as if someone had been searching for something specific. Yet, surprisingly, several valuable items, a laptop, a camera, and a collection of jewelry, remained untouched. This was no ordinary robbery. The attackers had come with a purpose, though it remained unclear what that was. In a back corner of the house, they found a small, hastily scrawled note on a piece of crumpled paper. It read, "You should have kept quiet." The chilling message indicated that someone had likely been targeting Ryan, possibly related to his recent whistleblowing at the organization. But there were no immediate suspects and no clear lead to follow. Detective Sarah Moore, the lead investigator, felt the weight of the case. She was known for her unrelenting dedication, especially when it came to cases with such brutality. She had seen countless crimes, but the calculated rage in this one was different. She walked slowly through the house, piecing together a mental map of what might have happened. Outside, neighbors began to gather, whispering to one another, shocked by the sudden appearance of police cars and the gravity of what was unfolding. The neighborhood was one of those quiet places where everyone knew everyone's business, and crimes of this nature were unheard of. As officers asked questions, friends and neighbors expressed disbelief. Everyone knew Ryan and Anya as kind, warm-hearted people who seemed to have no enemies. Detective Moore interviewed Mark, trying to keep his shock and grief from overshadowing the importance of his statements. She asked about Ryan's recent work and whether there had been any specific threats or troubling encounters. Mark revealed Ryan's recent concerns about corruption within their organization and how he had reported suspicious activity involving funds and supplies. Ryan had mentioned to Mark that he feared he was being watched, though he hadn't gone into details. It was like he thought he could handle it himself. Mark explained, his voice trembling. He didn't want to worry Anya. He just kept saying it was his responsibility. The information marked a significant lead for Detective Moore. If Ryan's suspicions had indeed put him in harm's way, then someone with a lot to lose from his discovery might have been desperate enough to silence him. She noted down every detail, determined to find out who had wanted to harm such an admired and gentle man, and why they had involved Anya in the brutality. The investigation quickly expanded as the police conducted a thorough search of the house, analyzing fingerprints, looking for any overlooked clues, and reviewing the few security cameras in the neighborhood. They reached out to the community organization where Ryan worked, asking for records and any recent complaints he might have filed. Anya's friends and colleagues were equally distraught when they heard the news. The children at the hospital, who adored her art classes, were told only that Anya was away. Her colleagues, struggling to process her loss, mourned the joyful, creative spirit she had brought to their lives. Each friend and family member interviewed echoed the same sentiment. Ryan and Anya had radiated kindness, and no one could fathom why anyone would want to harm them. As night fell on the first day of the investigation, the house was silent once more, save for the quiet murmur of the police radios and the hum of the streetlights. Detective Moore stayed late, studying the photos of the crime scene, letting the details sink in. She knew they were at the start of a long and difficult investigation. The evidence suggested that Ryan and Anya's deaths were a targeted attack, but the motive remained shrouded in mystery. Moore couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply personal about this crime. The rage, the strange message, and the selective ransacking all pointed to someone who had a grudge. Someone close enough to know their routines but calculating enough to cover their tracks. The next step would be crucial. They needed to understand exactly what Ryan had uncovered at his organization, who might have been involved, and whether it had made him any enemies. As Moore left the station late that night, she felt a sense of duty unlike any she had felt before. Ryan and Anya's story, their love and their kindness, had touched her. She was determined to seek justice for them, no matter how long or difficult the road might be. Uncovering the crime scene. The next day, Detective Sarah Moore returned to the house, ready to dive deeper into the evidence left behind. She was accompanied by forensic specialists and additional officers who had gathered to comb through every inch of the Torres home. The gravity of the crime weighed heavily on each investigator's mind, and Moore was determined to find the person, or people, responsible for tearing apart a couple so beloved by their community. As they re-entered the scene, Moore took in the details once more, letting her mind piece together the fragments of chaos. Anya's art supplies lay scattered on the floor, dried paint stains marking the area where her easel had been overturned. A notebook was open nearby, its pages smeared and unreadable, but one word caught Moore's eye: hope. It was the title of the mural Anya had been creating for the Children's Hospital. It seemed cruelly ironic now, given the devastation surrounding them. Forensic analysts had already noted peculiarities in the layout of the room. Expensive electronics were untouched, as were most valuables, yet specific drawers and cabinets had been emptied. It was clear that the assailants had been looking for something. But what? The taunting note, "You should have kept quiet," made Moore suspect that Ryan's recent whistleblowing had provoked this horrific act. She suspected that someone was desperate to cover their tracks, and her intuition told her that the answer lay in his work at the disaster relief organization. Detective Moore decided to pursue this angle further. She contacted the organization's director, Mr. Collins, to arrange a formal interview and request access to their records. When she arrived, she noticed an unusual tension in the office, a stiffness in the air that seemed to suggest something amiss. "Detective Moore, thank you for coming in." Mr. Collins greeted her, his handshake firm but his smile strained. "I'm sorry to be here under such terrible circumstances," she replied, studying him carefully. Ryan Torres was an exceptional volunteer, and his dedication to the organization was evident to everyone who knew him. "I'm here because there are indications that his death may be related to his work here. Would you be able to walk me through any issues Ryan might have raised?" Collins shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the office before responding. Ryan was indeed dedicated. I think he cared almost too much sometimes," he replied, choosing his words carefully. He was passionate about ensuring that the aid went to the right people, and he wasn't afraid to speak up if he noticed anything wrong. Recently, he did bring some discrepancies to our attention. Missing funds, supplies that never reached their destinations. But we have been looking into it. These things happen sometimes, and we try our best to address them. Moore noted the vague response, her instincts sharpening. "Did he report any specific individuals he believed were responsible?" she asked. Collins hesitated before answering. He mentioned a few names, but they were mostly contractors or temporary staff, people who come and go. Ryan was persistent, but we didn't have concrete evidence to support his suspicions. Our finances are complex, and sometimes mistakes get made. Detective Moore wasn't convinced. She requested access to the reports Ryan had filed and asked to interview some of his colleagues. Collins agreed but remained evasive, as though shielding more than he was letting on. Moore took note of his behavior, wondering if the organization's leadership was aware of deeper problems, or worse, involved. As she left the building, her phone buzzed with an update from the forensic team. They had found fingerprints on the crumpled note left in the Torres home. The prints didn't belong to either Ryan or Anya, which meant they could potentially identify a suspect. The lead gave Moore a renewed sense of determination as she headed back to the station. Over the next few days, Moore began conducting interviews with several employees and volunteers at the organization. One of Ryan's colleagues, Sandra, seemed particularly eager to talk. She was a quiet woman in her 40s, with tired eyes and a cautious demeanor, but she had known Ryan well and seemed deeply affected by his death. "Detective, I'm not supposed to say much," Sandra began, her voice barely above a whisper, but Ryan was right to be suspicious. "Things haven't been honest here for a long time. Supplies go missing all the time, and money that's supposed to go toward our outreach programs just vanishes." When Ryan tried to confront Mr. Collins and some of the board members, he was told to back off. "Did anyone threaten him directly?" Moore asked, sensing that Sandra knew more than she was letting on. "Not directly, no. But there were whispers," Sandra replied. "People warned him that asking too many questions wasn't safe. He brushed it off, of course. That's who he was. He thought he could make a difference, even if it meant stepping on some toes. But there were people here who didn't want him to dig too deep." Moore took detailed notes, grateful for Sandra's bravery. The information painted a clearer picture of the underlying tensions at the organization and confirmed that Ryan's investigations were, indeed, a possible motive for his death. That evening, Detective Moore received another call from the forensic team. The fingerprint analysis had yielded a match. A man named Luis Ortiz, a former contractor for the disaster relief organization. Ortiz had a history of petty theft and was known for his ties to small-time criminal circles in the area. According to the organization's records, Ortiz had worked briefly with them on a recent project, but had been let go due to unreliable performance. Moore immediately put out an APB on Ortiz, hoping to find him before he went further underground. The following day, Ortiz was apprehended in a neighboring town. He was brought in for questioning, his demeanor cocky and defiant. Moore watched him carefully, sizing him up as she began her line of questioning. "Mr. Ortiz, you were recently employed at the Disaster Relief Organization. Can you tell me about your time there?" Ortiz shrugged, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Sure, it was an easy gig. Nothing special." "Were you aware of Ryan Torres?" Moore pressed. Ortiz's expression changed, his cockiness wavering for a moment. "Yeah, I knew him. He was the goody two-shoes type, always poking his nose where it didn't belong." "Did he ever confront you about missing supplies or funds?" Ortiz laughed bitterly. "Oh yeah, he tried. Thought he was some kind of hero. He didn't know what he was getting into. People don't like it when someone threatens their meal ticket." Moore felt a surge of frustration at his evasiveness. "Did you visit his home recently?" Ortiz's smirk returned, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You left your fingerprints at the crime scene," Moore said, leaning forward, her voice cold. "And you left a note. You should have kept quiet. Do you really think we're going to believe that you had nothing to do with what happened?" Ortiz clenched his jaw, the mask of arrogance fading as he began to understand the gravity of his situation. "Look, I didn't do it alone. There are people in that organization who were involved. I was just doing what I was told." "Who told you to do it?" Moore pressed, her voice low and intense. Ortiz hesitated, glancing around the room as though seeking an escape. "You wouldn't believe me even if I told you," he whispered, his face pale. "These people, they got money, power. I was just a pawn." Detective Moore's heart pounded. This was the lead she had been waiting for, the confirmation of a conspiracy that went deeper than she had anticipated. She left the interrogation room, her mind racing with the implications of Ortiz's words. As she prepared her case, Moore realized that the investigation was far from over. With powerful individuals seemingly pulling the strings, she would need all the evidence she could gather to ensure that justice was served. A trail of connections. Detective Moore felt the weight of what lay ahead as she reviewed the new evidence in the Torres case. The revelation from Luis Ortiz that there were powerful people pulling the strings at the Disaster Relief Organization unveiled a dangerous web of corruption. Moore knew she would be risking her career, and perhaps even her life, by digging deeper into the organization's connections. Yet for Ryan and Anya's sake, she felt compelled to press on. She sat at her desk, studying the organization's financial records that had been turned over to her team. Her gut told her that the discrepancies Ryan had uncovered were just the tip of the iceberg. Moore's eyes scanned page after page of expenditures, looking for any patterns that might reveal the culprits behind the missing funds. She noticed several large payments for consultant fees and supply costs, many of which led back to companies with no clear association to the organization's operations. One name kept appearing in these records: Riverton Consulting. It was a shell company she hadn't heard of before, and a quick background check showed it was registered under an anonymous LLC. Moore made a note to follow up on this lead and consider issuing a subpoena for Riverton's financial records. Whoever was behind the company might be the same person pulling strings within the organization. As Moore prepared her next moves, she decided to confront Mr. Collins, the organization's director, once again. She wanted to see his reaction when she brought up Riverton Consulting. Perhaps it would be enough to shake loose a confession, or at least gauge his involvement. When Moore arrived unannounced at the organization's headquarters, she found Collins in his office, looking harried and defensive. He appeared less composed than he had during their first meeting, as though the strain of the investigation was finally catching up to him. "Detective Moore," he greeted her, forcing a smile. "I wasn't expecting you today." "Mr. Collins, thank you for seeing me on short notice. I have a few follow-up questions regarding your organization's financial records." She kept her tone even, giving him no hint of suspicion. "Of course, we're happy to cooperate fully with your investigation," Collins replied, though his fingers drummed nervously on his desk. I noticed several payments made to a company called Riverton Consulting. Moore began, watching his reaction closely. Can you tell me what services they provided for the organization? Collins faltered, his eyes darting away before he quickly composed himself. Riverton. Yes, they were involved in some logistical support. We needed extra help coordinating the supply chain for our relief efforts. Interesting, Moore replied, leaning forward. Because as far as I can tell, Riverton Consulting doesn't actually exist beyond some shell paperwork. Would you mind explaining that discrepancy? Collins' face grew red. He fumbled with his words, trying to mask his discomfort. Well, I'd have to look into it. There might be an explanation I'm not aware of. These things can be complicated. Mr. Collins, I think we both know what's happening here, Moore said firmly. I'm aware that Ryan Torres reported financial irregularities involving Riverton Consulting before his death. He was concerned about funds meant for disaster relief going elsewhere, funds that people at this organization may have pocketed. Now, I need you to be honest with me. Who is behind Riverton Consulting? Collins looked trapped, sweat beading on his forehead. He hesitated, glancing at the door as though considering making a run for it. Finally, he let out a shaky sigh and leaned forward, lowering his voice. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Detective. The people behind Riverton, they're powerful. They have connections, and they don't care who they hurt to protect their interests. I didn't want to be involved, but they forced me into it. They said they'd ruin me if I didn't comply. Who are they? Moore pressed, her heart pounding as she sensed she was close to breaking the case open. Collins glanced around, his voice barely a whisper. Riverton is a front for a group of investors, local businessmen with ties to some very unsavory individuals. They funnel money through Riverton under the guise of consulting for disaster relief, but it's all laundered for other ventures, some of them illegal. They wanted Ryan gone because he was getting too close. And you helped them, knowing that. Moore's voice was sharp, disbelief and anger simmering beneath her professional tone. Collins looked defeated, his hands trembling as he wrung them together. I didn't know they'd go that far. I thought maybe they'd scare him off, or find a way to make him leave the organization. I didn't know that they'd kill him and his wife. Moore's stomach churned. The depravity of these people, willing to destroy lives to protect their money, made her resolve even stronger. She now had enough to dig further into Riverton Consulting and follow the money trail to these elusive investors. Returning to the station, she gathered her team for a briefing. She outlined the connection she had uncovered, explaining that Riverton Consulting was likely the heart of the corruption. Her team would need to build a strong case, documenting every transaction and linking each suspect to the scheme. She requested they pull records from all affiliated companies and reach out to financial forensic specialists to track every dollar of misused funds. The investigation led Moore and her team into the shadows of the city, revealing a network of businessmen and officials who seemed to operate above the law. It was a grueling process, with Moore working late into the night, poring over files, meeting with informants, and building a case strong enough to bring down the whole operation. Over the following weeks, more pieces began to fall into place. Surveillance footage surfaced, showing several of the organization's board members meeting with figures known to have ties to organized crime. One man, Jonathan Reese, was particularly noteworthy. Reese, a wealthy local investor with a polished public image, appeared frequently in photos alongside city officials and high-profile business owners. Yet beneath this facade, Moore discovered that Reese was the main orchestrator behind Riverton Consulting. Moore's team obtained a wiretap on Reese, hoping to catch him in conversation with his associates about the Torres case. Days passed without incident, but finally, late one evening, they intercepted a call between Reese and a man whose voice they didn't recognize. Look, we had to take care of it. Torres was digging too deep, and we couldn't have him ruining everything we built, Reese said, his voice cold and unfeeling. Do you think the detective's going to get close? The other man asked. We've covered our tracks well enough. Besides, if she becomes a problem, there are ways to handle it, Reese replied, a thinly veiled threat lingering in his words. Moore listened to the recording, her blood boiling as she realized the depths to which these men would sink to protect their empire. Reese's casual dismissal of Ryan and Anya's lives, as if they were simply obstacles to be removed, solidified Moore's commitment to taking him down. With enough evidence in hand, Moore moved to obtain arrest warrants for Reese, Collins, and several others tied to Riverton Consulting. She coordinated with her team to execute the arrests simultaneously, hoping to prevent any one of them from tipping off the others. On the day of the arrests, Moore and her team surrounded Reese's lavish mansion. Armed officers breached the gates and approached the house, surprising Reese and his associates during a private gathering. Reese's shock quickly turned to anger as he was handcuffed, but Moore met his gaze steadily, feeling a grim satisfaction as justice finally caught up with him. "I hope it was worth it," she told him, her voice laced with contempt. "Ryan and Anya Torres were good people. They didn't deserve what you did to them." Reese sneered but said nothing as he was escorted into a police car, his empire crumbling around him.